It's a beautiful spring day here in Ashtabula, Ohio. So I need you to use some imagination, if you would. Imagine, if you will, it's 7:30 p.m. on December 29th, 1876, and Northeast Ohio and Northwest Pennsylvania are in the grip of a terrible blizzard. Philip Bliss and his wife Lucy are traveling westbound to Chicago, Illinois on the Pacific Express, a lakeshore and Michigan Southern Railway that parallels Lake Erie. Mr. Bliss is an evangelical and one of the world's most renowned musical composers, Christian musical composers, who has a meeting in Chicago. Now, this meeting was originally scheduled in January, but it got pushed up to the last Sunday in December. So he and his wife Lucy left the kids, their two children, at his parents' house in Pennsylvania, and they are on the train and have just crossed over from Pennsylvania into Ohio. They are approaching the sleepy little town of Ashtabula. They only have minutes left to live. The Ashtabula Bridge disaster is considered the worst railway accident of the 19th century. It claimed the lives of approximately 92 people and changed the face of the rail industry. Today's tale is one of terror, negligence, sorrow, and is certainly not for the faint of heart. So if you're curious, let's take a walk through history. It was the wildest of winter nights. Blizzard conditions with lake-effect snow squalls hardened even the most hardy of the lakeshore residents. 3 hours behind schedule, the train had left Buffalo, New York the night before and was struggling to get through the snowpack that covered the rails. The weather was so bad that the train needed 2 locomotives named Socrates and Columbia to pull the 11 rail cars through the blinding storm. And even then, the train only averaged about 10 miles an hour. As the train crossed the cast iron bridge here in this location, the engineer heard a loud crack and felt his locomotive sliding backward. So he gave it full power and was actually able to get the lead locomotive up onto the rest of the rails. As the bridge failed behind him, taking the second locomotive and the 11 cars down below a 70-foot drop to the Ashtabula River. The sound of the wreck could be heard half a mile away as rail cars flipped and tumbled and landed on top of each other in a splintering of wood and metal and twisted steel. Some of the passengers died instantly upon impact from the 70-foot drop. Of those who perished, those few who died instantly were the lucky ones. Frightening shrieks arose from the wreckage, and some passengers were able to break out windows and crawl out into the waist-deep icy waters and snow, their only chance of freedom. But then the fires started. These rail cars were heated with oil lamps and stoves, and once they came to the bottom in a heaping pile, the lamps and the stoves caught fire. So now here's where we have the real tragedy. We have passengers who are pinned below. They can't move, and they have survived the fall. They are essentially now living through their own cremation. Must have been a horrendous sound to hear and a terrible sight to see. Some of the passengers who actually were able to escape went back into the flames to try and retrieve loved ones. Philip Bliss was one of those. Philip was able to kick out a window and escape into the waist-deep icy water. But then he realized his wife Lucy was not there to join him. As he looked back, he saw her pinned in the wreckage, unable to move. So he went back into the fiery inferno, the crematorium, if you will, to try and rescue her. Philip and Lucy never made it out and were never recovered. There were some people who were trapped at the very bottom of the wreckage. So you have this fiery inferno raging above them. It's starting to melt the snowpack and started to raise the water level. Unfortunately, these passengers who were still alive but trapped were being cooked from above, but started to drown from below. So the crash was heard at the railroad's 32nd Street station, just a few hundred yards west of where we are right now. Those workers and rescuers came running to the location where the crash happened. John, if you could pan over. I know it's hard to see, folks, but you can kind of see where an embankment comes down along the edge, right where those trees are growing up. That was the access, the rail access down to a shed of some sort. Wow. They had to come down a set of stairs, a flight of stairs right there, and many of the rescuers were like, to heck with it. It was so snow-packed and so icy that they, in a sense, just slid down all the way down to the wreckage to try and help the people who were trapped, those who were still alive. The city of Ashtabula's fire brigade also came on scene, but their help was really minimal. They had a fire chief named G.W. Knapp, and when he wasn't drunk, he was still slow to react. By the time the horse-drawn fire pumps arrived, he had already told them not to bother hooking up and putting water on the flames because it was of no use, even though you could still hear people crying out in the wreckage. At least one member of the town, after begging the fire chief to put water on the fire, decided to take measures in his own hands, rallied people around, including some members of the fire brigade, grabbed buckets from the fire brigade themselves, and started throwing buckets of water on the flames. Imagine an inferno of 11 rail cars here, just in massive flames, and these people are doing their best by throwing buckets of water on the fire. It's a sad state indeed. Of those passengers who were able to escape the fall, the fiery destruction, the drowning, most of those died of smoke inhalation. So think in terms of this now. You have those people who have made it out. They're in terrible shock. They have no clue as to what just happened to them. There are people down here trying to help them. They were hauled away back up the incline, either carried up or put on sleds and carried up and sledded up to the top of the incline. But Ashtabula had no hospital. It was thought that back then the town was so small that there was no need for emergency facilities. So these passengers who were in dire need of medical attention ended up at several hotels and even residents' personal houses to try and render aid and care to them until help arrived. So not only was this a tragic event occurring right in front of people's eyes, there was also a point in time where the worst of people came upon the site. You had thieves posing as rescuers who were moving among the dead and injured. But instead of helping, we're robbing. Ashtabula's mayor, hearing of the thievery, stationed guards at the site. Now, some of the money and valuables were later recovered as part of an amnesty deal, but not all of it. Only about $1,500, that's roughly $31,000 today, was recovered, but the rest was never found. Minutes after the accident happened, telegraphs were sent to Cleveland, letting them know that they needed medical assistance. Charles B Leake was at the telegraph office at the train station that night, and he proved to be a real hero in the entire situation. First of all, Mr. Leake was the very first telegraph operator who was black in the nation's history. He had retired, but he was on the job that night because the normal night telegraph operator had a tendency to fall asleep on the job and was removed from his position. So Mr. Leake was on the job, frantically sending telegraphs to and from. It ended up that he worked 48 hours straight, sending telegraphs, helping loved ones find other loved ones who were involved in the wreck, letting families know if their loved ones had survived or not. It was a long ordeal for him. Charles would later ascend to the title of head of operations for the telegraph office. Again, a first for a black American, right here in Ashtabula. By 10 p.m., the train in Cleveland, loaded with all the medical supplies, the doctors, of course the press, and rail workers, were leaving Union Station in Cleveland, heading east to the site. But let's not forget, there was a blizzard raging outside, and they had just as much trouble getting to the site as this train had getting to the bridge. At one point in its journey, the train coming from Cleveland couldn't make it through the snowdrifts. They were so high that the twain of the locomotive couldn't push through. So the rail workers actually got off the train with shovels in hand to dig the snow out so the train could continue to pass eastward toward Ashtabula. By the time the relief train made it to this location, the cremation was complete. The only survivors left were the ones who were taken up the embankment to safety. The rest were here, how do I say it, in a cremation pile that was unidentifiable. It was a horrific sight to see.
When the morning came, all that remained of the Pacific Express was a row of car wheels, axles, brake irons, truck frames, and twisted rails lying in the black pool at the bottom of the gorge. On either side of the ravine frowned the dark and bare arches from which the bridge had fallen, while at their base the great heaps of ruins covered the men, women, and children who had suddenly been called to their death. There were no remains that could ever be identified. Old or young, male or female, black or white, no one could tell. They were all alike in their crucible of death. Piles of iron lay on the thick ice or bedded in the icy river. The fires smoldered in great heaps where many of the hapless victims had been all consumed, while men went about in wild excitement, seeking some trace of a lost one among the wounded or dead. All told, nearly 2/3 of the souls aboard the train were lost in the disaster. Several would never be identified. Some, such as Philip Bliss and his wife Lucy, would be identified by eyewitness accounts of the disaster. Others, like Mary Burchard, cousin to Ohio's then-Governor Rutherford B. Hayes, were known to be on the train, but remains were never recovered. Soon, the questions started to arise. What could have caused this bridge to collapse? In those days, traveling by train was a dangerous proposition. There were many wrecks in Ohio, mostly due to the rail company's desire to expand as quickly as possible with the least amount of cost.
There were several investigations after the disaster, including one by special committee in the Ohio State Legislature, where Chief Railroad Engineer Charles Collins testified. Collins, whose duty included ensuring the safety of the bridge, inspecting the bridge, visited the site and reportedly wept uncontrollably. After his testimony, Collins was found dead at his home in Cleveland, Ohio, of an apparent self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. Though Collins' death was initially ruled a suicide, his skull was later transferred to the chief medical examiner in New York, who determined that the location of the wound might suggest that it wasn't suicide after all. If that's so, Charles Collins' murder was never solved, and his murderer was never found.
Amasa Stone, director of the railroad, designed and built the Ashtabula Railroad span using the Howe truss design, a popular method of railroad bridge construction. However, instead of the wood braces commonly used in the Howe truss bridges, Stone insisted on an all-iron structure, a novel idea for its time, and one that utilized the resources of his brother's iron fabricating firm, the Cleveland Rolling Mill Company. During the manufacturing process, air bubbles may have gotten trapped inside the bridge's iron castings, weakening those castings in periods of extreme cold. An inquiry by the American Society of Engineers concluded that among the many design and composition flaws of the Ashtabula Bridge was a fatigue fracture that started at a small air hole in a cast iron block, which grew with repeated crossings and stress over the years. It was also discovered that Stone fired an engineer who prepared detailed drawings for the bridge after they disagreed over how much stress the span's components could handle. Amasa Stone, one of the wealthiest railroad tycoons of his time, suffered huge financial losses after the disaster. Depression soon overwhelmed him, and eventually, on May 11, 1883, Amasa locked the bathroom door in his Euclid Avenue home in Cleveland, pointed a gun to his chest, and pulled the trigger. Among the few positive outcomes of the disaster were increased standardization of reliable bridge designs and state-mandated annual inspections of railroad bridges, a program that expanded across the country. Another outcome of the disaster was creation of a permanent medical treatment facility in Ashtabula, which later became the Ashtabula County Medical Center. In 1882, a small emergency hospital opened to care for injured railroad workers. Work immediately began to raise funds for a permanent facility. On June 30, 1904, Ashtabula General Hospital opened its doors, at a cost to build of $14,500.
There is other lingering evidence of the disaster, perhaps none more grim than this monument in the city's Chestnut Grove Cemetery. It's a 37-foot tall memorial where the bodies of the unknown are buried from the accident. This cemetery is also the site of the final resting place of the railroad's chief engineer, Charles Collins. And it is said that at times his ghost can be found leaning against this obelisk and weeping for those who perished. The Ashtabula County Public Library is home to some artifacts from the disaster, including some melted lumps of metal and some clothing that was worn by those on the train. To see these artifacts, go upstairs to the genealogy department and ask for Carrie. She was very helpful in our research for this video. And that's where the human side of this calamity really hits home. The personal belongings. It was amazing to see. When we were there looking at one of the dresses, I'm not sure if it was a doll dress or a child's dress, but obviously burn marks and what we believe to be some blood stains. It's very sobering to know that those articles of clothing were attached to somebody who was part of that disaster. It's said that one of the largest items, personal items, that was recovered from the train disaster was the trunk of Philip Bliss. And inside the trunk was the only known song that Philip wrote that he hadn't yet written the music to. The song was called "I Will Sing of My Redeemer." When that manuscript made it out into the world, a fellow composer named James McGranahan set the words to music. It just so happens that that song is one of the very first songs that Thomas Edison ever recorded. Thanks for watching today, folks. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you would please like, subscribe, leave a comment. I really do love chatting with all of you in the comments. And we'll see you next time as we explore more curious history. Take care.